It was April 14th, 1976, and Thomas Harlan was 32 years old when he drove his father's tractor off the farm for the last time. He didn't tell his father where he was going. He left before sunrise, while the old man was still in the barn checking calves. The road into town was empty. The tractor ran rough, like it always did. Thomas had the title folded in his jacket pocket and a dealer's business card he'd been carrying for 3 weeks. By noon, the old tractor was gone. In its place sat a Massey Ferguson 275, red and clean, still smelling like paint and grease. Thomas drove it home slowly, feeling the difference in every gear. It didn't shake. It didn't hesitate. When he pulled into the yard, his father was standing by the fence, watching. Thomas shut off the engine. His father didn't move. He stood there for a long time, looking at the new machine, then turned and walked back toward the house. He didn't say a word. That silence would last the rest of his life. If you've found something in this story that feels familiar, something about decisions that seem right at the time but carry weight you didn't expect, then this might be a channel worth staying with. We tell stories like this one, slowly and carefully, because some things can't be rushed. If that sounds like something you'd value, consider subscribing. Thomas had grown up on 240 acres in southern Illinois, land his grandfather bought in 1928 with money saved from railroad work. The farm had never been large, but it had always been enough. His father, Raymond Harlan, ran it the way his own father had, carefully, without waste, without debt. Raymond didn't trust new equipment. He believed a machine should last as long as a man could make it last. The tractor Thomas traded in had been on the farm since 1958. It was older than Thomas's marriage, older than his daughter. Raymond had rebuilt the engine twice, replaced the clutch 4 times, and refused every suggestion that it might be time to upgrade. Thomas had learned to farm by watching his father work in silence. Raymond wasn't cold, but he wasn't open either. He taught by example, not explanation. If you didn't understand something, you watched until you did. That was the way things were. By the time Thomas turned 30, he was doing most of the heavy work. His father still made the decisions, still handled the money, still signed the papers at the grain elevator, but Thomas ran the equipment, planted the corn, baled the hay, and fixed whatever broke. And the old tractor broke constantly. It didn't matter how many times they rebuilt it. Every spring, something failed. The starter, the carburetor, the hydraulic lines. Thomas spent hours in the shed, hands black with grease, while his father stood nearby and said nothing. The tractor had become a test, not of the machine, but of Thomas himself. In the winter of 1975, Thomas went to the Massey Ferguson dealer in Carbondale. He didn't plan to buy anything. He just wanted to see what was available. The dealer showed him a 275, a mid-sized utility tractor, 4-cylinder diesel, enough power for their operation without being excessive. It was practical, it was reliable, it was exactly what they needed. The dealer offered a trade-in value for the old tractor. It wasn't much, but it was something. With that and a small loan, Thomas could make the deal work. He didn't need his father's money. He didn't need his permission. But he knew he should ask. He didn't. Thomas told himself he was doing the right thing. The old tractor was costing them time and money. Every breakdown meant delayed planting, missed windows, lost yield. A new machine would pay for itself in reliability alone. His father would see that, eventually. He'd understand. Thomas drove the Massey Ferguson 275 home that April afternoon and parked it in the same spot the old tractor had occupied for 18 years. He expected his father to be angry. He expected an argument, maybe even a fight. He was prepared for that. What he wasn't prepared for was silence. Raymond didn't yell. He didn't ask how much it cost or where the old tractor had gone. He didn't say it was a mistake or that Thomas had no right. He just looked at the new machine for a long moment, then walked away. That night at dinner, Raymond didn't mention the tractor. Thomas tried to bring it up, tried to explain the trade-in, the financing, the reasons, but his father cut him off with a look. Not angry, not disappointed, just closed. The next morning, Thomas went out to start the spring planting. The Massey Ferguson started on the first turn. No hesitation, no smoke, no grinding. He worked all day, covering more ground than he ever had with the old machine. When he came in that evening, his father was already at the table. "How'd it run?" Raymond asked. Good, Thomas said. Real good. Raymond nodded. He didn't ask anything else. The Massey Ferguson 275 ran flawlessly that first year. Thomas planted, cultivated, and harvested without a single breakdown. The fuel efficiency was better, the hydraulics were smooth, the machine did everything it was supposed to do. But Raymond never drove it. Even when Thomas offered, when he suggested his father take it out just to see how it handled, Raymond refused. He'd find other work, feed the cattle, mend fence, work in the shed, anything that didn't require the new tractor. Thomas told himself it didn't matter. His father was getting older. Maybe it was easier to let Thomas handle the field work. Maybe Raymond was relieved not to fight with failing equipment anymore. Maybe the silence was just his way of adjusting. But deep down, Thomas knew better. In the fall of 1977, the Massey Ferguson dealer called to ask how the tractor was performing. Thomas said it was running fine. The dealer asked if Raymond was happy with it. Thomas said yes, even though his father had never said a word about the machine. Not to Thomas, not to anyone. By 1978, the loan was half paid. The tractor still ran perfectly. Thomas kept it maintained, changed the oil on schedule, greased the fittings, checked the filters. He took care of it the way his father had taught him to take care of equipment, thoroughly, consistently, without shortcuts. But every time he started that engine, he thought about the trade-in. He thought about the old tractor, wherever it had ended up. He thought about his father, standing by the fence that April day, watching in silence. In the spring of 1980, Raymond had a stroke. It wasn't severe, but it weakened his left side and made it difficult to manage heavy work. The doctor said he could still be active, but he needed to avoid strain. Thomas took over more responsibilities, managing the cattle, handling the equipment decisions, dealing with the bank. Raymond spent more time in the house. He'd sit on the porch in the afternoons, watching Thomas work the fields. Sometimes Thomas would wave from the tractor. Raymond would nod, but he never waved back. Thomas's wife Ellen tried to talk to him about it. She'd known Raymond for over a decade, and she'd never seen him so distant. He's angry, she said one night after Raymond had gone to bed early. He'll get over it, Thomas said. It's been 4 years. Thomas didn't have an answer for that. That summer, the grain prices dropped. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to make the loan payments feel heavier. Thomas thought about selling some cattle to cover the difference, but Raymond refused. We don't sell cattle to pay for tractors, he said. It was the closest he'd come to mentioning the Massey Ferguson directly. Thomas worked extra hours that fall, baling hay for neighbors, doing custom work with the tractor to bring in cash. The Massey Ferguson handled it all without complaint. By the end of the year, the loan was nearly paid off. But the silence remained. In 1982, Thomas's daughter, Rebecca, turned 16. She'd grown up watching her father and grandfather work the farm, and she understood the quiet tension between them, even if no one ever explained it. One afternoon, she asked her grandfather why he never used the red tractor. Raymond looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "That's your father's machine." "But you could use it," Rebecca said. "It's easier than the old one was." "The old one," Raymond said slowly, "didn't need to be easy." Rebecca didn't understand, and Raymond didn't explain further. But Thomas, who overheard the conversation from the kitchen, understood perfectly. The old tractor had been a burden. It had required patience, persistence, and constant attention. But those things had been Raymond's contribution. Every time he coaxed it to start, every time he repaired it in the cold, every time he made it last another season, that was his work. That was his value. Thomas had removed the burden, and in doing so, he'd removed his father's role. By 1985, the Massey Ferguson 275 had been on the farm for 9 years. The loan was paid off. The tractor had required only routine maintenance, oil changes, filters, one set of rear tires. It had been everything Thomas hoped it would be. But Raymond still wouldn't touch it. Thomas tried one more time to talk about it. It was a Sunday afternoon in late autumn. Raymond was sitting on the porch, watching the fields. Thomas sat down beside him. "I should have asked you," Thomas said. "Before I traded it in, I should have asked." Raymond didn't look at him. Would it have changed anything? Thomas thought about that. "No," he admitted. "Probably not." Raymond nodded. "Then it doesn't matter." But it did matter. They both knew it did. That winter was harder than most. The snow came early and stayed late. The cattle needed more feed, more attention. Raymond's health was declining steadily now, though he refused to admit it. He still went out to the barn every morning, still checked the animals, still walked the fence line when the weather allowed. But he moved slower. His hands shook when he worked. Thomas watched him struggle and wanted to help. But he'd learned that offering help was the same as pointing out weakness. So he stayed quiet and let his father work at his own pace. One evening in February, Thomas came in from the shed to find Raymond sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of old photographs spread out in front of him. They were pictures from the 1950s and 60s, images of the farm in earlier years, of Raymond as a younger man, of the old tractor when it was new. Thomas stood in the doorway watching. Raymond picked up one photograph, a picture of himself standing beside the tractor in 1958, the day they'd brought it home. He looked at it for a long time, then set it down and looked up at Thomas. "You remember when we got this?" Raymond asked. "I was 14, Thomas said. "Your grandfather was still alive then," Raymond said. "He told me I was making a mistake, said I should have bought used, saved the money. But I wanted something that would last." Thomas sat down at the table. He didn't say anything. "It lasted," Raymond said quietly. "Longer than it should have, probably." Thomas looked at the photograph. His father looked strong in that picture. Confident, proud. "I didn't trade it in to hurt you," Thomas said. Raymond nodded slowly. "I know." They sat in silence for a while. Then Raymond gathered up the photographs and put them back in the envelope. He stood, moved toward the hallway, then stopped. "The new one's a good machine," he said, not looking back. "You made the right choice." It was the first time he'd acknowledged the Massey Ferguson in 9 years. It was also the last time they spoke about it. In the spring of 1988, Raymond's health declined further. He had another stroke, smaller than the first, but it left him weaker. He stopped coming out to the porch. He spent most of his time in the chair by the window, looking out at the farm, but no longer part of it. Thomas ran the operation alone now. The Massey Ferguson was 12 years old and still running strong. He'd added a grain drill, a disc harrow, a hay baler, all of it financed carefully, all of it paid off on time. The farm was stable, productive, efficient. But when Thomas came in from the fields each evening, his father barely looked up. Ellen tried to comfort him. "You did what you thought was right," she said. "You can't carry this forever." "He's carrying it," Thomas said. "Why shouldn't I?" In the fall of 1989, Raymond died in his sleep. He was 74. The funeral was small, neighbors, a few cousins, people from church. The pastor talked about Raymond's dedication to the land, his quiet strength, his integrity. Thomas stood at the graveside and thought about the last conversation they'd had. It had been about the weather, nothing important, nothing resolved. After the service, an older neighbor named Carl approached Thomas. Carl had farmed the land adjacent to the Harlan place for 40 years. He'd known Raymond since they were both young men. "Your father was proud of you," Carl said. Thomas looked at him. "He never said so." "That wasn't his way," Carl said. "But he told me once, must have been 5, 6 years ago, that you were running the farm better than he ever did. Said you had a good head for it." Thomas felt something tighten in his chest. "When did he say that?" "Spring of '83, I think. We were at the grain elevator. He watched you pull up in that Massey Ferguson and he said it right then." Thomas didn't respond. He couldn't. Carl put a hand on his shoulder. He was proud. He just didn't know how to say it after what happened. Thomas nodded. Carl walked away, leaving him standing alone by the grave. Raymond had been proud. He'd known Thomas was doing good work, but the silence had been too deep by then, the hurt too old. Neither of them had known how to cross it. After Raymond's death, Thomas kept farming. Rebecca had gone to college and wasn't coming back. His son, Michael, worked in town and had no interest in the land. Thomas knew the farm would end with him, but he kept working it anyway. The Massey Ferguson 275 stayed in service. By 1995, it had over 6,000 hours on it. Thomas rebuilt the engine that year, not because it had failed, but because it was time. He did the work himself, in the same shed where his father had rebuilt the old tractor decades before. As he worked, he thought about what his father would say. He thought about the hours Raymond had spent keeping the old machine alive, the pride he'd taken in making it last. Thomas had thought that pride was stubbornness. He'd thought it was inefficiency. Now, with his own hands covered in grease, working late into the night to keep a machine running, he understood it differently. Rebuilding that engine took him 3 weeks. He could have paid someone to do it faster, could have traded the tractor in for something newer. But he didn't. He stayed with it, the same way his father had stayed with the old one. When the Massey Ferguson started again, running smooth and clean, Thomas sat in the seat and felt something close to what his father must have felt all those years. Satisfaction in making something last, in refusing to give up on it. But he also felt the absence. His father wasn't there to see it, would never see it. In 1998, Thomas went to an estate auction 3 counties over. He didn't need anything, but he'd heard there would be old equipment, and he was curious. The auctioneer moved through plows, cultivators, wagons. Then he brought out a tractor, old, faded, barely running. Thomas recognized it immediately. It was the tractor he'd traded in 22 years earlier. Same model, same dent in the hood, same worn seat. Someone had used it hard, then let it sit. It didn't look like much. The bidding started low. Thomas raised his hand. He didn't know why. He just did. He won the bid at $800. He trailered it home that afternoon and parked it in the back of the shed. It took him 3 months to get it running again. The engine needed work. The electrical system was shot. The hydraulics barely functioned. But he stayed with it, the same way his father had stayed with it years before. When it finally started, the sound was rough and uneven, exactly as he remembered. Thomas sat on that tractor for a long time, listening to the engine. He thought about his father, standing by the fence in 1976, watching the Massey Ferguson pull into the yard. He thought about all the years of silence that followed. He finally understood what his father had lost that day. It wasn't the tractor. It wasn't even the money. It was the proof that his way, the hard way, the patient way, still mattered. Thomas had thought he was upgrading equipment. What he'd actually done was declare that his father's efforts had been wasted, that all those early mornings and late nights, all those repairs and rebuilds, all that persistence, it had been unnecessary, inefficient, the wrong approach. He hadn't meant it that way, but that's what the new tractor had said, and Raymond had heard it. Thomas kept both tractors after that. The Massey Ferguson 275 stayed in active service. The old tractor sat in the shed, running but rarely used. Sometimes Thomas would start it, just to hear the engine. Sometimes he'd sit on it and think about his father. In 2003, Thomas turned 59. The farm was still running, but he knew it wouldn't last much longer. Rebecca had her own life in St. Louis. Michael was managing a hardware store and had no plans to return. The land would be sold eventually. The equipment would go to auction, but not yet. One afternoon that fall, Thomas was working on the Massey Ferguson, replacing a hydraulic line, when a neighbor stopped by. The man looked at the tractor and shook his head. "You still running that old thing?" he asked. Thomas smiled. "It's not that old." 27 years, the neighbor said. "Most guys would have traded up twice by now." Thomas thought about that. He thought about his father, who'd kept equipment running for decades. He thought about the silence that had defined their last 13 years together. "I guess I learned something from my dad after all," Thomas said. The neighbor didn't understand, but Thomas didn't explain. That winter, Thomas began sorting through his father's belongings, boxes that had been stored in the attic for over a decade. Most of it was paperwork, old receipts, tax records. But in one box, he found a small notebook. It was Raymond's record of the old tractor. Every repair was listed, every oil change, every part replaced. The entries went back to 1958 and continued all the way to early 1976, just weeks before Thomas had traded it in. The last entry was dated March 30th, 1976. Replaced fuel filter, checked timing, runs good. Thomas stared at that entry for a long time. His father had been maintaining the tractor right up until the end. It had been running fine. Thomas had told himself it was failing, that it was costing them too much, that it was time to move on. But his father had kept it running. Thomas closed the notebook and put it back in the box. He didn't know what to do with that information. It was too late to matter. too late to change anything. But it mattered anyway. In 2008, Thomas sold the farm. He was 64, and his knees weren't what they used to be. The land went to a younger farmer who planned to expand his own operation. The equipment went to auction, all of it except 2 tractors. Thomas kept the Massey Ferguson 275. He kept the old tractor too. He moved to a small house in town, with a garage big enough for both machines. People asked him why he'd kept them. He didn't have land to work. He didn't need equipment anymore. Thomas would just say they were worth keeping. What he didn't say, what he couldn't quite put into words, was that those 2 tractors represented the same thing from different directions. One was the choice he'd made. The other was the choice his father had lived with. Both mattered. Both had cost something. Ellen understood, even if she never said so directly. She'd watched the whole thing unfold. The trade-in, the silence, the years of distance between father and son. She knew what those tractors meant. One evening, sitting in their small living room, she asked him if he regretted it. "The trade-in?" Thomas said. "All of it." Thomas thought for a long time. "I regret not asking him first," he said. "I regret the silence. But the tractor itself?" He shook his head. "It was the right machine for the farm. It did what we needed." "But it cost you your father," Ellen said quietly. Thomas looked at her. "No, it didn't cost me my father. It just showed me I didn't understand him as well as I thought I did." In 2014, Thomas's health began to fail. He had trouble with his heart, then his lungs. The doctors said it was years of dust and diesel, the toll of a lifetime spent in the field. He moved into assisted living that winter. Before he left the house, he made arrangements for the tractors. The Massey Ferguson 275 went to a local museum that collected farming equipment. The old tractor went to a man who restored machines from that era. Thomas visited the museum once, a few months later. The Massey Ferguson was on display, cleaned and polished, with a small placard explaining its history. The placard mentioned the year, the model, the hours of service. It didn't mention Raymond. It didn't mention the silence. Thomas stood in front of the tractor for a long time. He thought about the day he'd brought it home, full of certainty that he was doing the right thing. He thought about his father, who'd never once climbed into the seat. He thought about all the conversations they'd never had. A young couple walked past, glancing at the tractor briefly before moving on to a larger machine nearby. To them, it was just an old tractor, a relic, a piece of history. To Thomas, it was the weight of every choice he'd ever made. Thomas Harlan died in February 2016 at the age of 72. His funeral was quiet. Rebecca spoke about his dedication to the farm, his work ethic, his integrity. She didn't mention the tractors. She didn't know the full story. Michael spoke too, briefly. He talked about his father's persistence, his commitment to doing things right. He mentioned that Thomas had kept 2 old tractors in his garage for years, even after selling the farm. He said he never really understood why. After the service, Ellen stood alone by the casket. She thought about the man she'd been married to for 46 years. She thought about the silence he'd carried, the weight of a decision made decades ago. She thought about how some wounds never quite heal, even when you understand them. The Massey Ferguson 275 is still at the museum. It sits in a corner of the main hall, surrounded by other equipment from the same era. Visitors walk past it, sometimes pausing to read the placard, sometimes just moving on. It's clean, well-preserved, a good example of mid-1970s agricultural engineering. But it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell you what it cost to bring that tractor home. It doesn't tell you about the silence that followed. It doesn't tell you about a son who thought he was solving a problem and a father who lost something he couldn't name. It doesn't tell you about a conversation that should have happened in 1976 but never did. It doesn't tell you about years spent working side by side while living in separate silences. It doesn't tell you about pride that looked like stubbornness or love that felt like distance. It doesn't tell you that some decisions, no matter how practical, carry weight that never fully lifts. The tractor ran for 32 years without major failure. It did everything it was supposed to do. It was efficient, reliable, everything Thomas had hoped for. But every time he started that engine, he heard the silence. And in the end, that was the only sound that mattered. The old tractor, the one Thomas bought back in 1998, still exists too. It's owned by a collector in Kentucky now, restored to near original condition. It runs well. The engine is strong. Someone takes it to shows occasionally, where people admire the restoration work. That tractor outlasted Raymond. It outlasted Thomas. It will probably outlast everyone who ever knew what it meant. But it can't tell its story either. It can't tell you about the hours Raymond spent keeping it alive. It can't tell you about the morning in April 1976 when it left the farm for the last time. It can't tell you about the son who thought he was making the right choice, or the father who never forgave him for making it alone. Both tractors are just machines now, objects, history. But for 13 years, they were the space between two men who loved each other but couldn't find the words. That's what they cost. That's what they'll always cost.